Hey, Grd11s. Sorry about the first time this didn't actually record properly. I think I must have hit some sort of odd button or somehow I leaned on my mic and just closed the whole thing. I have no idea how I did that. But anyway, let's go for it. All right. So we're talking about phylogeny now. So this is directly related to a lot of evolution. And it's the basics of evolution before we actually get into it next year. So what you see in front of you is something we call the tree of life. Now, a lot of you know the more crazy, sort of esoteric, weird version where it's like all the living things on Earth, and that's ultimately what it is, except in science. So it is very much a tree, but scientists don't often use a tree specifically to do it. And what you can see is that on that specific diagram in front of you over there, is that every time there is at the end of a branch is a brand new group of individuals or a new species or a new phylum for whatever that matter is. So it literally shows like where we came from in terms of origin and where we ended off. And at each time one of the new branches pops off, we find a brand new group of individuals. So the first group of individuals you find over there is bacteria, and then as you go on we find mitochondria and nuclei, and then eventually we end up in green algae, and then the green algae that also goes into hornworts, ferns, so on and so forth. So each time that branch disappears off, you can notice that a new species evolves. And please also note that every single time a new individual arrives within the tree of life, it doesn't mean that it dies out. And a good example is where the green algae is over there, and then ferns, conifers, dicots, so on, are coming off of it. The green algae still survive, even though new species are coming directly off of that. So this really just shows like how one individual changes into the next, and it's not like there's a bright glowing light, but because some sort of mutation has occurred, or something has happened to the individual, it has changed, and it's changed so much that it has become a new group of individuals and or a new species. So this is something slightly more biological. This is what we use, and this is the tree of life for everything that is living, and this is actually a simplified version of it. So if you look directly in the center of that circle, you'll see a line that's jutting out. And at that point, that is where all life has originated from. And we often think that it is some sort of protist or some sort of amoeba that has led to all of the life that has occurred over there. From there, you can also see there's humans, there's dogs, there's chickens, and everything is represented based on how it has split off of the original common ancestor. And we'll get to what that definition is a little bit later. So a phylogenetic tree, so this is evolutionary relationship, so it's just like how related certain organisms are to each other. So phylogenetic trees show how organisms are related and show some sort of pattern of evolution, okay? And this is its definition. So it shows a pattern of branching which indicates ancestry, and the length of the branch indicates the time since last common ancestor. So it's not time as in like millions of years ago. You can see that there's no indication, and I've put a very generic sort of tree of life in over there, or a phylogenetic tree, just so that you guys get a feel for what we're about to do. So what you can see is that right at the bottom we had a common ancestor, and if we want to quickly give a definition for the common ancestor, it's when one species gives rise to two or more species, and this doesn't mean that the common ancestor dies out, okay? It could mean that it does die out, but we'll indicate that in a graph or in one of these trees, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Okay, so cladogram is a special kind of phylogenetic tree, and this is the one we use in schools, well, specifically in grade 11, because it's easier for you guys to understand. So it does not contain information about the evolutionary time, and I just want to point out some bits and pieces on there. So right at the bottom we have the common ancestor, which we spoke about earlier, and we can also say the ancestral ancestor, or the ancestral organism. Is just the organism that gave rise to all the others. And you can see from that blue cladogram over there that different species are coming off of it. So you've got the sharks, the rafe and fish, the amphibians, primates, rodents and rabbits, crocodiles and birds. And then you notice these little red lines all over the place. So there it has vertebrae. So which means that remember, this is only just showing a chunk of living organisms. We don't often represent everything. It's completely unnecessary. So this is just showing a specific part, and from the specific part you can see that we had developed a skeleton, okay? So those were the vertebrae. And then from there we had sharks. Now remember, sharks don't have a bony skeleton, they have a cartilaginous skeleton. We remember from grade 10. Then something had changed within the species of sharks, and we started developing bony skeletons, okay? And these bony skeletons had led to the ray-finned fish. From there, we started developing 4 limbs, okay? And from those 4 limbs, we then had the amphibians. So it just goes to show that a amphibian shares vertebrae, bony skeleton, and 4 limbs. From there, we then have the amniotic egg, which allowed things to give birth on land. We moved away from the dependence on water. So then, therefore, the primates, rodents, and rabbits, crocodiles, and birds all have amniotic eggs, 4 limbs, bony skeleton, and vertebrae. And you can see how they are related based on how many characteristics they share with each other. So this is just an easier way and some terminology that you need to know. So this is showing how how a phylogenetic tree works. So right at the top we have taxon A, taxon B, and taxon C. So let's say, for instance, this was bacteria, which was C, and plants as A, and animals as B. So right at the bottom over there, we had some sort of ancestral organism or common ancestor, and from that it split. When it split, it then continued as taxon C in this instance. So there wasn't a change in taxon C, it just remained as taxon C, which this doesn't always happen, but remember, it can also be available. On the left-hand side, however, we're going to form a common ancestor, A and B. So there was something that had changed from the original organism. So something had changed from taxon C, and then it caused some sort of variation, and then it split into taxon A and taxon B. So taxon A can be a group of individuals, such as the plants. Taxon B can be a group of individuals like the animals. It could be slightly more specific as well. So taxon A could be all of your angiosperms, and taxon B could be your gymnosperms, for that matter, and taxon C could be ferns. All right, so it just depends on what level you're looking at, which will cause you to be able to recognize who is more and less related. So from this instance, taxon A and taxon B are very closely related, but taxon A is not as related to taxon C as it is taxon B, and the same goes for taxon B. So taxon B is closely related to taxon A, but not as closely related to taxon C, even though they share a common ancestor. Where we see the common ancestor of A and B, that shows how related two different groups are. So here is a lovely little example from the idea of bears. So the line shows the descent, or how the organisms changed over time, and the nodes show where species have diverged. So something has happened that has caused it to change in such a way that it's become a brand new species, and it goes off of that particular line or lineage as a whole. So the brown bear and sun bear are more closely related to each other than they are to the dog. So the dog is far right hand side, and you can see that there's been a whole bunch of these little red lines which indicate that something has changed over time. So for instance, we had the brown bear, then the cranium structure, or the skull structure, had actually changed. This caused the sun bear to arrive. Once the sun bear was living for a bit, then the snout structure changed because of some random mutation, and this gave rise to the speckled bear. So that means that the brown bear is related to the sun bear, and the sun bear is related to the speckled bear, but the brown bear is not as closely related to the speckled bear as it is with the sun bear. Then after the snout structure changed, we found that the ear structure had changed. And when the ear structure changed, we then had the giant panda, red panda, raccoon, and dog, and they were split based on the type of fur as well as the tail that was released on top of it over there. Okay, then we had the tips of so this is related to plants specifically in the group that we just did, and this is going to help you quite a lot when we do animal biodiversity as well. So what I've also included is that I've put millions of years ago on the far left hand side. So now you can actually see the amount of time it's taken for the evolution to take place, or the natural selection to occur, or the mutation, when the mutation was first arrived. And the way that scientists actually figure this out is they're able to pull up all of the fossils, and those fossils then indicate how the entire structure, well, like when these certain things arrived. Okay, so please don't think that they kind of just like haphazardly just appeared out of the middle of nowhere. There is scientific proof for a lot of this. So we find that we're not going to deal with the Carophyceans just because they are very ancient and we don't really know how they work, so we just leave them out. But they are very similar to types of algae, as well as things that live in the ocean. Then we have the origin of plants, and the origins of plants where we specifically find liverworts, hornworts, and mosses occur about 480 million years ago. And then from there, we can see that after they moved on land, they started developing early vascular tissues, and then this vascular tissues led to the pteridophytes, so your lycophytes, your ferns, horsetails, whisk ferns. I'm not too worried about the lycophytes, but I am worried about the ferns. And this arrives at approximately 320 million years ago. Then we find our early seed plants appearing, okay, and this is your gymnosperms and your angiosperms. So the gymnosperms will probably occur quite late. You can see it's probably closer to about 300 million years ago, and then eventually when we specifically go to angiosperms, that means that we go back about 150 million years ago. So this shows how like plant itself has evolved over time, and that evolution has led to new species being produced. And at the end of every single one of those branches, in this instance, is different kinds of phyla. Now, if you look right at the top over there, you can see which certain types of plants actually share which characteristics. You're not always going to get this, but it is a good way of actually using it. So right at the top, you see land plants. Those land plants are all your bryophytes to angiosperms. Then we have vascular plants, which is pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. And finally, we have seed plants, which are your gymnosperms and angiosperms. And what makes angiosperms special is the fact that they have flowers. Okay, and you'll notice that on the far right-hand side over there. Then, this is a simplified version of the whole thing, and I expect you to be able to draw something like this, and we'll practice this in the next slide as well. So these are your plant groups. So we had this green algae ancestor, and that bit at the bottom right-hand corner, I really recommend you go and study for yourself, because it's going to help you in defining what a plant group is. So green algae are thought to be the ancestors of plants. They're similar size, color, and appearance, similar reproductive cycles, identical cell walls, and pigments used for photosynthesis. So that is ultimately going to help you define what the common ancestor of plants are. So first and foremost, we see the mosses and their relatives. We're not going to include the rest of the names. We're just going to deal with the most specific one. Then we had some sort of water conducting or vascular tissues, which is xylem and phloem. They started developing, and then that led to the creation of ferns and their relatives. After ferns and their relatives, seeds started developing, and we found cone-bearing plants. And eventually, once that had changed enough, we found flowers, seeds, and enclosed fruit. Now remember, those seeds and enclosed fruit is when we have the embryo inside and we have some sort of fruit on the outside. And please remember that it doesn't always just mean like apple. It comes in a whole bunch of different forms as well. So now what I'd like you to do is name the phyla at the top of these phylogeny trees. So right at the bottom over there, we have the first node, and off of that directly to the left is the least evolved of the plants. Then vascular tissues form. Tell me what is the phylum on the second one from the left. And then we have seeds, which is the second one from the right. And finally, what group of plants develops into flowers. So I want you to redraw this, and I want you to actually write this in your notes, please. All right, so now let's practice a little bit. The first one I will help you with, and then after that, you guys are kind of on your own. And there's one more after this. So use the following cladogram to answer the questions that follow. So we have the lancet, which is a type of fish. It's a very, 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 very basic animal. If you want to, you must go and Google it. It's actually quite an interesting looking structure. Then we start developing a vertebral column. So in other words, a skeleton arrives, and then we have a lamprey that forms. And that is a type of fish that actually has teeth, and they're actually able to drill their way into the skin of fish, sharks, and those kinds of things, and they actually suck out blood and nutrients, and that's what allows them to stay alive. Then we find the development of jaws, and those jaws lead to tuna or fish as a whole. Finally, those fish develop 4 walking legs, and then we find salamanders. So they're still based in the ocean or based in water, but they're now able to walk on land for small amounts of time, but still need a very moist skin, so they need to be close to water. Finally, we have the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg is something that is enclosed in a calcium shell. All right, so then we find that we have the turtle, and the turtle starts producing stuff like scales, and then eventually we have hair or fur, and then we produce a leopard. So let's look at the questions. Which trait separates lampreys from tuna on this cladogram? So now you're going to go to where lamprey and the lancet kind of meet, and you notice there that the vertebral column is the one thing that separates them. So what is the trait? It is the vertebral column. What separates a salamander from a turtle? It's the fact that the turtle, well, something sort of developed an amniotic egg, and that separates the two of them. Which organism is most related to the leopard? Yes, it's the turtle, because they're closest to each other. So the distance shows how related they are from each other. So yeah, the turtle, which is quite weird, but it's interesting. So which organism's DNA will differ the most from the leopard, and why? So that would be the one that is furthest from the leopard, which is the lancet. So because there has been so many changes in traits, you will then realize that it would cause the DNA to have changed so often that they're completely different individuals. And that's why their DNA is most different, because they are less evolved in terms of the lancet and more involved in terms of the leopard. Okay, so here is another one for you to practice. I'm not going to do this. I want you guys to do this by yourself. So what separates the rabbit or primate from the crocodiles on this cladogram? Have a look at the rabbits and primate from the crocodiles, and what is the one main thing that splits that whole chunk from the other chunk? Which organism is most related to rodents and rabbits? So what is the one group of individuals that is closest, that still is from the same node? So which 5 traits do birds and its closest relatives share? So I want you to have a look at all those little red lines. Which organism will have DNA most similar to the bird? Look at the one that shares the closest node. And which organism's DNA will differ most from the bird, and why? Okay, so I want you to try this out. I hope this has helped you quite a bit. Have a fantastic day, ladies. Bye.